Isaac Newton famously said, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." The very world of science and research is dramatically shifting with the emergence of generative artificial intelligence. With Google's NotebookLM, as well as many other tools, we are scrambling to figure out what this means for our future.
Welcome to the Grand Challengers Podcast, a show about inspiring individuals who are stepping up to tackle the global challenges that our world is facing in their own unique ways.
This is a special mini-series on Google's NotebookLM, featuring previous guests from the show and insights into the potential and perils of generative AI in science and research.
Join us on not only this little experiment, but also some deeper dives into key topics we have covered on the show so far.
From urban nature-based solutions, climate change, urban planning, ecology, livability, and even perspectives on AI in our urban environment as well.
AI is here to stay, accessing our vast collection of human knowledge, summarizing and synthesizing it, and presenting us with generated words, images, videos, voices, and much more. So join me, Peter Markus Bach, and my guest on today's episode, Lucas Gobatti, on this journey as we explore just how well AI can explain our work on vegetation, cooling, and its broader planning and social implications. Please enjoy. Lucas.
Hello.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
It's not been long since we last recorded your episode.
Right.
But welcome to this special mini-series.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, where we are trying to figure out if AI is here to take over the world or to support the world.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Hopefully to support.
Hopefully to support. So, listeners, welcome to this special mini-series where we are recording our live reaction to how an AI, large language model, turns our research work into a fully fledged podcast episode. And I guess it's also to test the longevity of the Grand Challengers podcast. Now, nevertheless, we've had AI featured on several past episodes of the podcast, and with rapid evolution of the technology, the question begs to be asked, what can we do with it? What is the potential, and how do we use it and leverage it for being more productive, being more innovative, supporting us with creating a better place to live.
Yeah.
How it works, we've chosen a paper that you've authored, Lucas, that I've authored with you as part of your PhD work. We spoke about the topic a bit on your episode. It's about the cooling establishment time, namely this idea that when you implement blue-green infrastructure, it often takes some time before we can actually see a heat mitigation benefit.
Yeah.
The paper is titled "Using Satellite Imagery to Investigate Blue-Green Infrastructure Establishment Time for Urban Cooling," published in Sustainable Cities and Society in 2023, volume 97, authored by yourself, Lucas, myself, Andreas Scheidegger, and João Paulo Leitão, who's also been on the show before. And how it works is we've run this paper through the AI model, Google NotebookLM. It's built with Gemini 2.0, which is Google's large language model. And it's a personalized AI research assistant. It's a tool where you can upload sources and gain instant insights, summarized information, and clear citation for any references that it shows. But more interestingly, it's also a tool that generates an entire deep dive discussion, as they call it, or a podcast episode of two voices.
Very impressive.
Yeah, very impressive. What are your experiences with AI so far?
I use ChatGPT a lot in work for programming. Sometimes I also use Humata also to summarize some papers and to ask questions for papers, and also Perplexity that also gives you the sources of the answers that the model provides you. And I think that's it. And now a little bit of scope. We've been using a little bit of Scopus AI and understanding how does that go. And it's also pretty interesting outcomes from that.
Yeah. So we'll listen to what Google NotebookLM has produced. We'll react to it. So you've never heard this recording. So yeah, it'll be a live reaction. I myself have only heard the beginning. But yeah, I'll also be surprised. And let's see what opportunities and perils await us.
Yeah, let's see how that goes.
So, Lucas, if you can give me a quick summary of the paper itself, what can readers expect to find if they were to read this paper?
So, in this paper, we retrieved satellite imagery satellite data from Landsat satellites. And we applied a very simple graphical model to compare the NDVI data, which is the, let's say, the greeners of vegetation.
The normalized difference vegetation index.
Yeah, the NDVI. So highest the NDVI, the highest is the health of that vegetation, let's say. And also we retrieved land surface temperature. So by comparing the two things, we could reach a graphical point where land surface temperature just plateaus. So first we showed that land surface temperature and NDVI have some sort of correlation. That's something that we expect and that we knew from before. And after that, the innovative part is to show that land surface temperature reaches a plateau, which then we called cooling establishment time. And now we want to continue that research and further investigate if that CET will have influences or differences in other climates, hopefully. But that's the basic idea of the paper.
Yeah. So without further ado, let's listen in.
All right. So today we're going to take a deep dive into cooling establishment time.
Okay.
It's basically all about how long it takes for green spaces to cool down cities. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about parks, green roofs, those swanky vertical gardens.
Yeah.
Anything that sort of brings nature into that concrete jungle.
Right.
Turns out it's not as simple as just plopping in some greenery and expecting the temperature to drop overnight.
Very, very interested second speaker.
The second speaker interacting a lot. Right. Yeah.
Swanky vertical gardens. No.
Yeah, this research from the Swiss Federal Institute of Aquatic Science and Technology really dives into this idea of cooling establishment time. So basically trying to understand how long it takes for those green spaces to make a measurable difference in temperature.
So why is this even important? I mean, we all know trees and plants are good for the environment.
Of course.
Yeah, so what's the big deal?
Well, cities face this unique challenge, the urban heat island effect.
Okay.
All that concrete asphalt and lack of shade. They trap heat, making cities significantly warmer than the surrounding areas.
Yeah.
And it's not just about comfort either. It's a serious health hazard, especially during heat waves.
So the idea is that these green spaces can kind of combat that heat island effect.
Exactly. Plants have this incredible ability to cool things down through shade and something called evapotranspiration.
Evapotranspiration?
Yeah. Basically, they release water vapor, which cools the air around them. It's like their own natural AC system.
Wow, that's pretty cool. But this research suggests it doesn't happen overnight, though, right?
You got it.
So
what's fascinating is that these researchers used decades of satellite data to track how long it took for newly built green spaces in Zurich to actually make a difference.
Wow, I'm a bit out of words, actually.
I mean, as a podcast producer, I'm trying to figure out if they literally also included all the clicks and the weird sound effects as well.
Right.
But coming back to the actual topic itself, I mean, what do you think of this introduction?
I think that was pretty good. And I think they really do the work of outreach to like put into simple words. I don't even know like how simple was that we put in the paper to be so clear like this, kind of reaching the wider audience. Maybe there was some not so good clarity on the main process itself, like with evapotranspiration that releases this vapor that cools down. It's not the vapor that's cooling down, but the actual phase transition between liquid to vapor that sinks latent heat, right?
Converts the sensible into latent heat flux, and as a result,
exactly, yeah,
creates that cooling effect. Yeah,
exactly. But I mean, it's there. The idea is there. It's not, and I think to make it as an outreach exercise, I think it's amazing. It's really good.
Let's keep going.
Yeah.
They were looking at how the city changed over time using the temperature of specific pixels in satellite images to isolate the cooling effect of those green spaces.
Decades of satellite data. That's some serious commitment to understanding this.
It is.
So what did they find? Did all this research lead to anything useful?
Absolutely. They found that different types of green spaces have different cooling rates. Grass and low-lying plants are the quick coolers, showing results in just a couple of years.
So like a quick spritz of water on a hot day.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. What about trees?
Mm-hmm.
I've always heard that planting trees is one of the best ways to combat climate change.
Oh, trees are incredibly important, but they're more like a long-term investment.
Okay.
They need time to grow and establish their full canopy, so they can take 7 to 10 years to reach their peak cooling power.
Wow. They got the numbers right.
So if a city needs to address a heat wave hotspot quickly,
right,
maybe just planting a bunch of trees isn't the best strategy then.
That's a great point. It might be more effective to plant grass or other fast-growing vegetation for a quicker impact, but for long-term climate resilience and a whole host of other benefits, trees are still the gold standard.
So it's about choosing the right solution for the right situation.
Exactly.
And it sounds like this research could really help city planners make more informed decisions.
Absolutely. If you're looking for a quick fix for a heat wave, maybe go for the grass. But if you're thinking about long-term climate resilience, those trees are worth the wait.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I was also a bit skeptical. I think it's a hard way to put it that just the grass is going to be a quick fix. I think that kind of overextends a little bit the conclusion. But of course, the grass, the first part was pretty clear. The grass have a quicker impact than the trees. And I think we stay at that. I think we don't push extra as they did as a quick fix, kind of. It's not a quick fix, let's say.
We didn't write it that way, did we?
Hopefully not.
No. I guess it's a good use for AI, checking if it makes sense or not, the words you choose.
But pretty impressive that they, like, when we transformed this paper into that little video for Nature, for the Science in Shorts competition, we used exactly those numbers. Because in the graphs, I think there's quite a variety of numbers, but we set it the same way. So 2 to 3 years and then 7 to 10 years. We used exactly the same idea.
Yeah, I guess that's the quick message to communicate, and NotebookLM was able to pick up on that immediately. I guess it's also in the abstracts.
I think it is, yeah.
And we're only 3 minutes in, but it feels like it's been summarizing the abstract.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true.
This research gives planners the data they need to weigh those options and choose the best approach.
This is fascinating. It's like there's a whole science behind how we cool down our cities.
There is.
What else did this research uncover? Were there any big aha moments?
One of the most interesting findings was that the cooling effect of green spaces was most noticeable during the summer. In winter, the difference in temperature between areas with and without green spaces wasn't as significant.
So when you're sweating it out next summer, think of those trees and parks working hard to cool things down.
Yeah.
Nice.
But this research was all focused on Zurich.
It was.
What about other cities around the world?
She
That's
sounds so
what's so
disappointed.
exciting about this research.
Good question.
It opens up a whole new world of possibilities. Imagine being able to apply this method to cities worldwide.
Yeah.
We could create a global map of cooling times for different types of green spaces, helping cities prioritize the best solutions for their specific climate and needs.
Okay. I'm starting to see how powerful this could be. But it's not just about the type of green space, right?
Right.
What about the design and layout? Does that matter too?
That's another key takeaway from this research. The shape, size, and arrangement of green spaces can all impact how quickly they cool down.
Interesting.
They looked at a variety of projects in Zurich, from parks and squares with integrated vegetation to even a building with a green atrium.
An atrium. That's not exactly what I picture when I think of green space.
It might not be a park, but it's still incorporating nature into a built environment.
Right.
And they found that design plays a big role in cooling efficiency.
Pretty interesting.
Which building was that? Are we talking about the park in the Oerlikon district in Zurich?
No, it's in Heinestrasse. There was a closed down, like, square-shaped building, like a square donut or something. That the part in the middle, which had a green intervention.
Yes. What I find interesting is that they refer to Zurich by name, but I'd be curious if they're going to refer to the other districts that we mentioned in the paper by name as well.
Yeah, true. That's true.
Yeah.
And pretty interesting that it kind of brought a subjective, like an atrium is not something that I would picture, or kind of, no? Pretty interesting as well.
I guess it's questionable, because when you think about planning of green infrastructure in other countries, I'm just thinking Singapore now. You know, Singapore has the planning regulation that you have to replace 100% of your built land area with greenery. And that means you can go inside the building, along the building facades, in all sorts of places. So I guess we have to be aware that green infrastructure can also be used in areas like building atriums.
That's true, yeah. Private gardens as well. They make a big proportion of the green area, especially for Zurich. And also, if you think about green roofs, the footprints of the buildings, they make a huge proportion for São Paulo, for example, that has a lot of the built environments pretty dense. So it's important to think about all the aspects of green infrastructure, not only in the public environment, but also in the private parts of the allotments.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh,
It's not just about adding greenery. It's about how you add it.
so there's a lot more nuance to this than just planting a few trees here and there.
Yeah.
This research is starting to make me rethink my whole understanding of urban planning.
That's the beauty of research like this.
Oh, we're glad.
It challenges our
Wow.
assumptions and gives us a new lens to view the world around us.
So design definitely matters.
Yeah.
Can you give us an example of how that played out in one of these Zurich case studies?
Absolutely. They looked at Tessenerplatz,
Okay.
a square
There
that
we
was
go.
redesigned to include trees. But even after the redesign, it still had a lot of paved surfaces.
So there was this mix of concrete and greenery.
Exactly. And that fragmentation of green space seemed to impact its cooling capacity.
Okay.
It took a while for the cooling effect to become noticeable, about 7 to 10 years. And even then, it wasn't as significant as some of the other projects.
So more concrete basically meant less cooling power.
That's what the research suggests.
Okay.
And it highlights the importance of maximizing contiguous green space
Right.
whenever possible.
Okay, so what about an example where the design was more effective?
Wallen Park was a great example of a project that worked really well.
Okay.
It was originally a building, but they transformed the area into a large park with a combination of grassland and trees.
So they went all in on the green space.
They did, and it paid off.
Uh-huh.
The area cooled down relatively quickly, reaching a stable temperature difference in just 1 to 3 years.
That's impressive.
Yeah.
What do you think made the difference in that case?
It was likely a combination of factors.
Oh.
The type of vegetation, the size of the park, and the fact that it wasn't fragmented like Tessenerplatz.
Mm-hmm.
It was a large, contiguous green space,
Yeah.
which seems to be key for maximizing the cooling effect.
So size and connectivity matter when it comes to green spaces.
It really does. And remember that case study with the irrigation system we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
That was Heinrichstrasse, a building with an inner courtyard that was transformed into a small irrigated park.
And that was the one that cooled down super fast, right?
You got it.
You got it. So, the point proven. They brought in other names as well. Although, have you ever been to Tessenerplatz? Tessenerplatz. That's what they're referring to. There's a few locations, but very interesting to hear the AI's attempt at pronouncing it.
Yeah, exactly.
But overall, now they're delving deeper into the actual content rather than just the overall message.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see like what are the conclusions that we had from our data and the possible explanations that we brought in the discussion. So for example, the connectivity part is not something that we were able to analyze from the primary data that we derived, but it was something that we brought in the discussion from the literature before that analyzed this. And we said, oh, probably the phenomenon that we saw here, and here has something to do with the stuff that other researchers observed.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. The topics in the beginning, it was more focused on our own innovations and the stuff that we brought. And now it's a bit of a mix between stuff that we observed and things that we discussed based on the literature. So this would be the literature aspect, like the clustering of vegetation and the connectivity that they mentioned. That's not something that we brought. We analyzed that,
It's something we would have mentioned in our definition of blue-green infrastructure. As part of the EU definition of green infrastructure, the interconnected green spaces is often a very crucial aspect, not just for heat, not just for water, but many other ecosystem services.
Yeah.
Interesting that it's starting to synthesize some of that information. And that's only based on having uploaded this paper to NotebookLM.
Exactly. That's impressive.
It reached its full cooling potential in just a couple of years.
Wow.
The researchers believe the consistent irrigation played a major role in that speedy establishment time.
That makes me wonder how irrigation could be used in drier climates. Could it help overcome some of the challenges those cities face?
That's a great question. And it highlights the need for more research in different climate zones.
Okay.
This study focused on Zurich, which has a temperate climate. It's very possible that green spaces would behave differently in a desert environment, for example.
So what works in Zurich might not work everywhere else.
Exactly. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
But this research is a great starting point.
Okay.
It gives us valuable data that we can build on to understand how green spaces can be used to cool down cities in different parts of the world.
This is all really fascinating, but there's one thing I'm still curious about. They talked about comparing the temperature of green spaces to nearby areas that didn't change.
Right.
How did they choose those comparison areas?
That's an important part of their methodology.
Yeah.
They carefully selected reference pixels in the satellite images. These pixels represented areas that hadn't undergone any major construction or land use changes during the study period.
So they were kind of like the control group in an experiment.
That's a great way to think about it.
Okay.
By comparing the green space pixels to these reference pixels, they could isolate the cooling effect of the green spaces themselves and separate it from any broader temperature trends in the city.
That makes sense.
Oh.
It helps eliminate any variables that could skew the results.
Exactly.
But I imagine it must have been difficult to find those pristine, unchanged areas in a city like Zurich.
You're right. Cities are constantly evolving, but they were able to identify suitable reference pixels.
Yep.
And that's what allowed them to make such precise measurements.
Pristine, unchanged areas, highly urbanized as well. But a very interesting way of summarizing or delving, so transitioning into the scientific method.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I was skeptical to see how they would explain that process. Is not super simple, but they explained the first big process that we put the data through, which is the comparison with the surrounding environment to take out or diminish the effect of the heat island in general.
Yeah.
And yeah, really, really interesting. Really interesting.
Definitely.
Well, it's clear they put a lot of thought into their methodology.
They did.
But even with a solid methodology, there are always limitations to consider. What were some of the limitations of this research?
They were very upfront about the limitations of their study. One key limitation was the spatial resolution of the satellite imagery.
You mean the size of those pixels they were analyzing?
Exactly. Each pixel represented a 30 meter by 30 meter area on the ground. So if a green space project was smaller than that, it could be difficult to accurately measure its cooling effect.
So it's like trying to paint a detailed portrait using a giant paintbrush.
I love that analogy.
Wow.
Yeah.
It
That
really
is a
captures
nice
the
one.
challenge.
Wow.
And that means their findings might not be applicable to very small-scale green space projects.
Okay.
Like a tiny rooftop garden or a single green wall.
Makes sense. What were some of the other limitations?
Another key point was that the study was limited to Zurich's climate,
Right.
which, as we mentioned, is temperate. Yeah. The cooling effects of green spaces could be very different in other climates.
So we can't just assume these findings apply to a tropical rainforest or a desert.
Not necessarily. More research is needed to understand how green spaces perform in different climates and urban environments.
Right.
But that's part of what makes this research so exciting. It opens up so many new avenues for exploration.
Okay, so lots of potential for future research.
All right.
Anything else they pointed out as a limitation?
They also mentioned that the satellite imagery they used only captured daytime temperatures. So their data didn't reflect any nighttime cooling effects that the green spaces might have provided.
That's interesting. So it's possible that green spaces are even more beneficial than this research suggests.
It's definitely possible.
Or even
And
less.
it highlights the need to consider the full 24-hour cycle when we're evaluating the impact of green spaces.
Okay, so we've talked about the science, the methodology, and even the limitations.
Hmm.
But I'm also curious about the human side of this. What about the social impact of green spaces?
That's such an important aspect. It's not just about the technical aspects of cooling.
Right.
It's about how these green spaces impact the people who live and work in these urban environments.
So they moved on from the heat aspect and have broadened this out. I mean, to what extent did we go into depth there? I mean, obviously, whenever we write papers on blue-green infrastructures, my philosophy is to then always link it back into the multi-benefits and I guess the implications of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know, I don't remember how much did we talk about the social aspects of it. For sure, we mentioned one thing that they already mentioned, which is the vulnerability aspect.
Yeah.
So if we want to do more urgent interventions closer to the population that's experiencing a higher heat vulnerability, we need stuff that acts faster. Probably that's what they are going to talk about.
Yeah.
The rest, I don't know. I don't know if they're going to bring up any fancy comparison as well. But I really like the fact that they kind of grasp the most important parts of the methodology with the comparison with the surrounding pixels. They explain that really well. And also at that moment, they highlight the fact that this is a method that we're bringing. Like we're not bringing so much of the final data. It's not a big data set that we're bringing. And that's actually a work that a bachelor student, Marina, is doing back in Brazil, applying this method to more areas and actually seeing if there's going to be a different effect on this into other areas.
Different climate zones, especially.
Different climate zones or different aspects that maybe we didn't even grasp in this first study because we had a very limited amount of case studies. It was just 6 or 8 case studies, if I remember right. So yeah, nice that they brought this up in the methodology moment.
Indeed. Let's see what they say about the societal aspects.
Yeah.
Right, because a park is more than just a patch of trees and grass.
Yeah.
It's a place for people to connect, relax, and escape the hustle and bustle of city life.
Exactly. And this research, while focused on cooling, does touch on some of those social benefits.
Okay.
They found that green spaces can improve the aesthetic quality of a city, making it a more pleasant place to live.
Which can also attract more visitors, boosting tourism and the local economy.
Precisely. And they also highlighted the potential for green spaces to create jobs, both in the construction and maintenance of these areas.
So it's an investment that can have ripple effects throughout the community.
Absolutely. And those social benefits can be just as important as the environmental benefits. In fact, they're often intertwined.
Indeed.
Because when people feel connected to nature, they're more likely to care about protecting it.
Right.
It's like a positive feedback loop.
You're absolutely right. And this research, even though it was primarily focused on the technical aspects of cooling, does offer some food for thought about those broader societal implications.
Which are definitely worth exploring further.
Yeah.
Maybe in another deep dive.
I'd love to do that. It'll be fascinating to delve deeper into the research on how green spaces impact social well-being, community engagement, and even crime rates in urban areas.
That's a great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's nice that they brought the social implications. I think they mean implications for people in general, not social inequality implications that I was expecting to see. But the creation of jobs, I remember that was something that we mentioned. I think has to do with the things that we discussed in the podcast before on maintenance, right? So you create those structures, you need maintenance. So that also means the opportunity for creating jobs that upkeep and care for those urban interventions that we think about now.
Yeah. I know back in the time when we were writing this paper, stewardship, so people's involvement and the sense of ownership as well as maintenance were at front and center of my mind around blue-green infrastructures. I mean, it still is, but I know I was particularly adamant about mentioning them. I think we did, but to then take these keywords and to really string it into a full-blown discussion is impressive.
Yeah, pretty cool.
Yeah.
But for now, let's focus on these specific case studies from Zurich. They looked at a variety of green space projects, right?
They did.
Going deeper.
And those case studies provide some really interesting real-world examples of how different types of green spaces perform in terms of cooling establishment time.
We've already touched on a few of them, like Tessnerplatz and Wallen Park.
Right. Those were good examples of how design can influence cooling time.
Tessnerplatz, the square with the trees.
Yeah.
Took quite a while to cool down, likely because of all the paved surfaces.
Exactly. It highlights the importance of maximizing green space and minimizing fragmentation.
Whereas Wallen Park, the former building that was transformed into a park, cooled down much faster, probably because it was a larger, more contiguous green space.
You got it. And it had a mix of grassland and trees, which likely contributed to its rapid cooling.
What about some of the other case studies? Did any of them stand out to you?
One that I found particularly interesting was MFO Park.
Okay.
It was a former industrial site that was transformed into a unique vertical park.
A vertical park. I've heard of those, but I've never actually seen one.
They're quite impressive. Basically, they built this metal structure and covered it with climbing plants. So it's like a living wall.
Okay.
But on a much larger scale.
Sounds amazing.
MFO Park, that was what I was referring to earlier. So I'm impressed that they got the acronym correct.
The acronym,
I guess when you write something with caps, all caps, then the AI will interpret it as that.
Yeah.
Certainly a very interesting case study because I know that was a unique in itself example of urban redevelopment as well. Yeah.
I bet it looks incredible.
It does.
But how did it perform in terms of cooling?
It actually took a bit longer to reach its full cooling potential, about 7 to 10 years.
Okay.
And that's likely because those climbing plants needed time to grow and fully cover the structure.
Makes sense. So patience is definitely a virtue when it comes to green space.
Oh, boy.
It is.
What about another case study?
Well, Hardo Park was another interesting one.
Okay.
It was a former parking lot that was transformed into a park with scattered trees.
That sounds like a much-needed improvement. I can only imagine how much heat that parking lot must have absorbed.
You're right. And it cooled down relatively quickly within 1 to 3 years.
Okay.
But what's interesting is that it didn't have the same dramatic temperature reduction as some of the other projects.
Why was that? Did they not plant enough trees?
They planted trees, but the researchers believe it's because the trees were scattered, rather than forming a dense canopy.
So even though there was green space, it wasn't as effective at blocking the sun's rays.
Exactly. It highlights the importance of tree placement and density in maximizing those cooling benefits.
So it's not just about how much green space you have, it's also about how you design that green space.
That's a great takeaway. And it reinforces the point we made earlier about taking a holistic approach to urban design.
Okay.
We need to think about the size, shape, and placement of green spaces to optimize their cooling potential.
It's like we're piecing together a puzzle.
Yeah.
And this research is giving us some of the missing pieces.
Exactly.
But there's still so much to explore.
Absolutely. Of course. And that's what makes this field so fascinating. There's always more to learn and discover.
Right.
You know, as we delve deeper into this research on how green spaces cool our cities,
yeah,
one thing that keeps coming to mind is the economic side of things.
Right.
All this planting and maintenance,
yeah,
it can't be cheap.
Was that a stutter?
Yeah, a stutter even. Wow.
I guess criteria. What makes a podcast natural?
Human.
Human, yeah. Creepy.
Wow.
That's a great point. We've been talking a lot about the environmental and social benefits, but we haven't really touched on the financial aspects. Mm-hmm. Where does the money for all of this come from?
That's a complex question, and it really varies depending on the city and the specific project.
Mm-hmm.
But generally speaking, funding for green spaces can come from a variety of sources.
Okay.
Government budgets, private investments,
mm-hmm.
even philanthropic donations.
So it's not just taxpayers footing the bill.
Not necessarily. There's a growing recognition that investing in green spaces is not just an expense, it's an investment in the long-term health and sustainability of a city.
That makes sense.
Right.
But I imagine the cost can vary widely depending on the type of green space project.
Absolutely.
A simple grass lawn is probably a lot cheaper to install and maintain than a full-blown urban forest.
Absolutely. And that's where the findings about cooling establishment time come in.
Okay.
I don't remember if we discussed so much about the economic aspects.
I don't think we went into that much depth.
Right?
Yeah. From understanding a bit about how this works, I mean, you've got the paper that is sort of guiding the AI in generating the deep dive conversation. Mm-hmm. But don't forget, you've got Gemini 2.0 backing it, which is trained on a much larger data set. So it would be bringing in context. I mean, otherwise you wouldn't have all these, these cheesy sayings.
Exactly. The painting, the pencil size. And
no, it's fascinating how they're using the analogies to explain the concepts, which we didn't even go to.
Yeah.
They can help us make smarter decisions about where to invest those limited resources.
Right. So if a city needs a quick and affordable solution for a heat wave hotspot, maybe a grass lawn is the more practical option.
Exactly.
But if they're thinking long term, those slower growing trees might be worth the wait in the investment, especially when you consider all the additional benefits they provide.
You're thinking like a city planner now.
There you go.
And it's not just about cooling.
Yeah.
Green spaces also offer a whole range of other economic benefits, like improved air quality, which can reduce healthcare costs, stormwater management, which can prevent costly flood damage, and even increase property values in neighborhoods with access to green spaces.
It sounds like green spaces are a pretty smart investment all around.
They certainly can be.
They are.
Yeah.
But like any investment, there are risks and trade-offs to consider.
Like what? What are some of the potential downsides?
One challenge is the ongoing maintenance costs.
Okay.
Keeping those green spaces healthy and thriving requires regular watering, pruning, pest control. It all adds.
Especially in a large city with lots of parks and green spaces.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of gentrification.
Right.
As neighborhoods become greener and more desirable.
Yeah.
Property values can rise, potentially displacing longtime residents.
That's a real concern.
Interesting that they are going into all these different issues, the pluses and the disadvantages as well.
Yeah.
Gentrification, green justice.
Yeah, discussing about the maintenance costs, which is pretty important as well.
Yeah.
But mentioning the gentrification, I think, was really good. And also making this clear approach of this as an investment, which in the end that's what it is, right? That's how you take it down to kind of how do you crystallize it to. Cool.
Although I have this impression that these two hosts are a bit too eager to tell the story and they start interrupting each other. Did you notice that?
Yeah, true.
Let's keep going and seeing where they're going next.
Yeah.
It's important to make sure that the benefits of green spaces are shared equitably across all communities.
I completely agree. And that requires careful planning and thoughtful implementation. It's not enough to just plant trees and create parks.
Yeah.
We need to make sure those green spaces are accessible to everyone.
Right.
And that they contribute to the overall well-being of the entire community.
That's a really important point.
It is.
It sounds like there's a lot more to this than just the science of cooling.
There is.
There are social and economic factors to consider as well.
Absolutely. And that's what makes this research so valuable.
Yeah.
It provides a framework for thinking about green spaces in a more holistic way, taking into account all of these interconnected factors.
So it's not just about creating cooler cities.
Right.
It's about creating better cities.
Exactly.
Cities that are healthier, more equitable, and more vibrant for everyone.
Exactly. And that's a vision worth striving for.
I agree.
Okay, so we've talked about the economics of green spaces, but there's another aspect we haven't touched on yet.
Okay.
The role of the community. How can residents get involved in this process?
That's a fantastic question.
Yeah.
Community engagement is absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
After all, these green spaces are for the people,
Right.
so their voices need to be heard.
What are some ways that people can get involved?
There are so many opportunities. People can volunteer at local parks, participate in tree planting events, advocate for more green spaces in their neighborhoods, even just get out there and enjoy these spaces with their families and friends.
It sounds like there's a role for everyone to play.
There is.
No matter their skill level or time commitment.
Exactly. Every little bit helps.
No matter their skill level or time commitment, you can go out there and just be present in the park.
Yeah.
They started with a general summary.
Yeah.
Then they went into details about the method. Now they're talking about the key areas of benefits.
Yeah.
Sprinkling planning in as we go.
Yeah, pretty interesting. Pretty interesting.
And when people feel connected to these green spaces, they're more likely to value them and advocate for their protection.
It creates a sense of ownership and stewardship.
Precisely.
Keyword.
And that's essential for the long-term success of any green space initiative.
This is inspiring me to get more involved in my own community.
I'd love to hear that.
But before I go out and start planting trees, I have a question about something we discussed earlier.
Okay.
You mentioned that the researchers measured the temperature of green spaces using satellite imagery.
Right.
How exactly does that work? Do satellites have thermometers or something?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
It might seem like magic, but it's actually based on some pretty cool science.
Okay.
The satellites they use don't actually measure temperature directly.
Okay.
Instead, they measure the amount of thermal radiation emitted by different surfaces on Earth.
Thermal radiation. That sounds complicated.
It's simpler than it sounds. Everything on Earth emits thermal radiation.
Okay.
Which is a type of electromagnetic radiation. The warmer an object is, the more thermal radiation it emits.
Okay.
So by measuring the intensity of thermal radiation coming from different parts of the city, the satellites can infer the temperature of those surfaces.
That's incredible. So they're basically creating heat maps of the city from space.
Exactly. And by comparing the temperature of green spaces to those reference pixels we talked about earlier, they can isolate the cooling effect of those green spaces.
It's amazing how technology is helping us understand the natural world in new and innovative ways.
I completely agree. And as technology continues to advance, we can expect even more sophisticated tools and techniques for studying and managing green spaces in cities.
That's exciting. It sounds like this field is constantly evolving.
It absolutely is. And that's what makes it so dynamic and engaging.
Nice how they put it simple, no? Because he asked that question, but how did they measure? Like, did they go with thermometers out there? Because that's how people kind of know, like baseline, how do you measure temperature? You use a thermometer. And then they explain, like, so it's not actually that, but it's not that complex as well. And it was like this. So
it's almost like going even more into the fundamentals.
Yeah, exactly.
And relating it to something that is commonplace.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm curious if they're going to touch upon the NDVI because you mentioned that at the start.
Yeah, I think they will. And I'm curious to see how they explain it. I'm sure it will be really good.
I hope so. I'd be disappointed if they didn't.
There's always something new to learn and explore.
Speaking of exploring, we haven't really talked about the specific types of green spaces that were included in this research.
Right.
Did they focus on any particular types of parks or green infrastructure?
They actually looked at a wide variety of green spaces in Zurich, ranging from small neighborhood parks to large urban forests, rooftop gardens, and even that green atrium we talked about earlier.
So they cast a pretty wide net.
They did, and that's one of the strengths of this research.
Okay.
It provides a comprehensive overview of how different types of green spaces contribute to urban cooling.
Well,
did they find any patterns or trends in terms of which types of green spaces were most effective at cooling?
That's a great question. And the answer is, it depends.
Okay.
The cooling effectiveness of a green space depends on a lot of factors, including its size, shape, the types of vegetation it contains, and even its location within the city.
So there's no magic formula for creating the perfect cooling green space?
Not exactly. It's more about understanding the principles of urban cooling and applying them in a way that's tailored to the specific context of each city.
So it's a bit like baking a cake.
Okay.
You need the right ingredients and the right recipe.
Yeah.
But you also need to adjust the baking time and temperature.
Right.
Depending on your oven and the altitude where you live.
That's a fantastic analogy. And it highlights the importance of considering the unique characteristics of each city when planning and designing green spaces.
Wow. Baking time.
Are you good at baking?
Not very good. Baking satellite data.
Altitude where you live.
Wow.
Does that actually affect listeners? If you know, or if you've ever baked a cake at two different altitudes across the globe, please do get in touch. I'm very curious to know whether this is really the case.
A listener at the beach and a listener in the mountains, please get in touch.
Yeah. We should do a research paper on that. Baking establishment time.
The baking is
BET for short.
This is giving me a whole new appreciation for the complexity of urban planning. It's not just about aesthetics or creating nice places for people to relax.
It's not.
It's about understanding the science of how cities function.
Exactly.
And using that knowledge to create spaces that are both beautiful and functional.
Well said. And this research on cooling establishment time, a great example of how science can inform and guide urban planning decisions.
Okay.
It's about moving beyond intuition and guesswork.
Right.
And using data and evidence to create more sustainable and resilient cities.
So it's not just about planting trees. It's about planting the right trees in the right places.
Exactly.
And managing them in a way that maximizes their cooling potential.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that requires a deep understanding of the interplay.
Okay. Between the built environment, the natural environment, and the people who inhabit these spaces.
It's about seeing the city as a complex ecosystem.
It is.
And working with nature, not against it.
I love that perspective.
Yeah.
And I think it's a perspective that's becoming increasingly important as we face the challenges of climate change and urbanization.
Speaking of challenges, we've talked a lot about the benefits of green spaces.
Right.
But are there any potential downsides or risks that we should be aware of?
Interesting.
I think it gets, as the narrative of the paper is a little bit repetitive, the narrative of the papers that we do nowadays. No, like we have the abstract, which brings the main ideas.
Yep.
There are the highlights. Well, the highlights are not in the PDF, but there are some ideas that we repeat, and they are repeating exactly the same way, right?
So you think the AI is analyzing it word by word from start to finish?
I think so.
The reason we've heard some repetition already is because of that sequential analysis of the material.
Yeah, I think so. Probably now they're going to mention gentrification again, if I would not be mistaken. But I think that doesn't necessarily is bad. No, because also in a podcast, we repeat ideas, we come back to, because if we want to reinforce and highlight main things, we tend to repeat them a little bit throughout the dialogue. So I think it's also good, not seen as a bad thing.
Yeah. Well, we're 24 minutes in. This paper's audio is one of the longer ones that NotebookLM has generated. Let's see what's going to happen in the last few minutes.
Yeah.
That's an important question.
Huh.
While green spaces offer a multitude of benefits, it's crucial to acknowledge that they can also present certain challenges.
Yeah.
If not planned and managed carefully.
Like what? What are some of the potential pitfalls?
One potential concern is the issue of unintended consequences.
Okay.
For example, if a city focuses solely on planting trees for cooling without considering the local ecosystem, it could inadvertently introduce invasive species that disrupt the natural balance.
Nice.
So it's not just about planting any tree.
Right.
It's about choosing the right trees for the right environment.
Exactly.
What are some other potential challenges?
Another consideration is the issue of water usage.
Oh, God.
Maintaining lush green spaces, especially in arid climates, can require significant amounts of water for irrigation.
That's a valid point.
Yeah.
Water scarcity is a growing concern in many parts of the world.
Exactly. So it's important to consider water-efficient landscaping practices, such as using drought-tolerant plants.
Okay.
And implementing smart irrigation systems that minimize water waste.
So there's a need to balance the cooling benefits of green spaces with the need to conserve water resources.
Absolutely. And that's where innovation and creative solutions come into play.
Okay.
We need to explore new approaches to green space design and management that are both effective and sustainable.
This is making me realize that there's a lot more to green spaces than meets the eye.
There is.
It's not just about aesthetics or creating pleasant places to relax.
It's not.
It's about understanding the science behind them.
Right.
And managing them in a way that maximizes their benefits.
Exactly.
While minimizing any potential risks.
That's a great summary.
I think one thing that I noticed that would be nice to point out is, now that we're approaching about the end of the audio file, is the weight that they put in the information in the paper, no? Yeah. Because lots of those aspects that they are bringing, they are of interest to the general public, but they are not central to the work that we did. Yeah. So if somebody would come and ask us about like, oh, what was the paper about? The paper is about that specific method that correlates land surface temperature with normalized difference vegetation index in those very minimal case studies that we still need to work more on and explore more stuff. We tried in the paper, of course, to explain the phenomenon that we were seeing with the literature in general or with other stuff that we know from the field that we are in. But that's not very central. So I feel that there's a lack of weight in the main message of the paper and too much weight in those other kind of sexy and interesting little facts that they can bring and make those interesting parallels.
Additional general contexts that, okay, they're just as important to know, but it takes away from the crux of the paper itself.
And in the end, I think it's a matter of like, what is the audience that you're aiming, right? So I think that would be really cool so that somebody that kind of wants to understand in general how to plan green spaces would listen to. But for example, if a student wants to replicate the work that we did and kind of get a general feeling of what we did, probably 20% of this would be useful so that the student kind of gets the idea roughly, right?
If you're new to this, it's a great introduction, general introduction. As we said, can be a bit repetitive, but I think we are assuming it's based on the sequential analysis of the content of the paper, which in scientific articles is often a bit repetitive in that way. Yeah. But as you said, if it's really about replicating the work, I mean, once you've read enough papers, you won't take 25 minutes to read through a paper. You would scan the abstract, scan the intro, results, methods, conclusions.
Yeah.
Not in that order. There are certain strategies. Everyone has their own.
Yeah.
So,
But I think it's also nice to kind of bring us a little bit some steps back and recognize that the work that we do is always inserted in a general field and a general approach and understanding of nature, let's say, right? So sometimes we tend to just think that what we do is just the very specific methods of a paper. Yeah. But the rest is also really important.
That's true.
To the context, the big picture. So, and this is also an understanding that we have, right? When we write a paper, we have to know really well what came before. We have to look into the future from what we've done.
Yeah.
So pretty cool that they put weight on this other stuff that sometimes we wouldn't put so much value. Yeah. But it's also part of the paper.
It's true. Let's see how they wrap this up.
Yeah.
And it highlights the need for ongoing research and collaboration between scientists, planners, and the community to ensure that we're creating green spaces that are truly beneficial for both people and the planet.
Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into cooling establishment time.
Okay.
We've talked about the science, the economics, the community aspects.
Right.
It's clear that green spaces are this powerful tool for creating cooler, healthier cities.
Yeah.
But, this research also got me thinking about the bigger picture. The long-term implications for how we design and manage our urban environments in the face of a changing climate.
That's a crucial point. this research isn't just about understanding how quickly green spaces cool down.
Yeah.
It's about using that knowledge to make smarter decisions about the future of our cities.
So it's about more than just adding a few parks and trees here and there.
Exactly.
About fundamentally rethinking how we approach urban planning.
We need to shift from a mindset of mitigating the negative impacts of urbanization to one of actively creating cities that are in harmony with nature.
Okay, that sounds like a pretty radical shift.
It is.
What would that look like in practice?
Well, for starters, we need to move beyond thinking of green spaces as these isolated pockets within a concrete jungle.
Okay.
Instead, we need to envision this more interconnected network of green infrastructure that weaves throughout the entire city.
So it's about creating a continuous flow of green spaces.
Exactly.
Connecting parks, gardens, green roofs, even street trees into a cohesive ecosystem.
Exactly. Think of it like a green circulatory system for the city.
Wow.
Providing multiple benefits, cooling air purifications, stormwater management, habitat for wildlife, and spaces for people to connect with nature.
That's a beautiful image.
Nice.
It sounds like we're talking about a paradigm shift in how we view cities. Not just as places where people live and work, but as living, breathing ecosystems.
Precisely. And this research on cooling establishment time provides a valuable piece of the puzzle.
Okay.
It helps us understand how those green spaces function within that larger ecosystem and how we can optimize their performance.
So it's not just about planting trees.
Right.
It's about planting the right trees in the right places at the right time.
Exactly.
And managing them in a way that supports their long-term health and resilience.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that green spaces are not static elements.
Okay.
They're dynamic systems that evolve and change over time. This research highlights the importance of thinking about that temporal dimension.
Okay.
How the cooling benefits of green spaces unfold over years and even decades.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like investing in a long-term savings plan.
Yeah.
You don't expect to see immediate returns,
Yeah.
but you know that with patience and careful management, those investments will pay off in the long run.
I thought long-term savings plans are set it and forget it.
Exactly. Yeah, they really like to go back to the economic analogy, no? I think that kind of makes people relate to it, kind of like this investment approach and like, what does that mean? Like very down to earth in terms of money, like, no.
Yeah. I mean, let's be real here again. We keep saying they, two hosts. It's one AI.
Yeah.
And we don't know what directly functions behind it, but yeah, it is possible that, a lot of the material revolves around economics. Our society revolves around it. And maybe that's, part of the reason why you make a lot of analogies that people can relate to.
Yeah.
Maybe that's been the common analogy that people use.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's a great analogy. And it applies not only to the environmental benefits of green spaces, but also to their social and economic benefits.
Right.
Creating a truly sustainable city requires a long-term vision and a commitment to investing in solutions that will benefit future generations.
This research is giving me a lot to think about.
It is fascinating, isn't it?
We're
It's
glad
both
to hear.
inspiring
Wow.
and challenging to consider the long-term implications of our actions today and how they will shape the cities of tomorrow.
I agree. And it underscores the importance of collaboration and innovation.
Right.
We need scientists, planners, policymakers, and communities working together to develop creative solutions that address the complex challenges of climate change and urbanization.
It's like we're all part of this grand experiment,
We are.
figuring out how to create cities that are not only sustainable, but also thriving, vibrant places for people to live, work, and connect.
That's a wonderful way to put it. And this research on cooling establishment time is a testament to the power of human ingenuity and our ability to use science and technology to create a better future.
Well, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
It has been a fascinating one.
It's been a fascinating journey through the science of urban greening, the economics of green spaces, and the potential for these spaces to shape the future of our cities. What's the one key takeaway you hope our listeners will remember from this deep dive?
If I had to choose just one, it would be this.
Okay.
Green spaces are not just a luxury. They're an essential part of creating healthy, sustainable, and resilient cities for the future.
Okay.
As we face the growing challenges of climate change and urbanization, we need to embrace a new paradigm of urban planning, one that recognizes the interconnectedness of nature and the built environment and prioritizes the well-being of both people and the planet
Beautifully said. And for you, our listener, we hope this deep dive has sparked some new ideas and inspired you to think differently about the role of nature in our urban lives. Maybe you'll start noticing those green spaces in your own city with fresh eyes, appreciating their cooling power, their beauty, and their potential to create a better future for all of us. Thanks for joining us. We'll catch you on our next deep dive.
So, I like the way they really involved the listeners.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
What did you think of the takeaway?
It's not necessarily what the paper's takeaway is.
Yeah.
But I think ultimately that's not meant to be the point of what this deep dive functionality is. I think it's setting it in the broader context.
Yeah.
And I think as it goes on, as you said, we notice a repetition, possibly because of the nature of the material that's used.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, it's not something you would consult for a quick summary of a research paper, maybe of multiple documents, which NotebookLM supports.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. So you could upload 5 papers and...
You can upload several documents. Yeah.
All right. And
yeah. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it was pretty interesting. I think I tried to go back to my own storytelling process with this paper as well. I think it brings me a bit the sensation of, in next papers, being a bit more aware, because I really think it was a step-by-step reading. Mm-hmm. So kind of being more aware of any repetitions that I bring up in the paper should make them more concise. So for me, concision is really something that I am exercising and trying to improve. Mm-hmm. The key takeaways, I also find it interesting to see like what were the takeaways for me. For example, making the Science in Shorts video for Nature portfolio, or their key takeaways. As you said, very different. For me, the key takeaway is plant a tree yesterday. So as simple as that. So if you want to have any outcome, you have to do it as soon as possible, because it just takes time to have those cooling outcomes. For them, it was more of a general picture.
Around green spaces,
but nice that they got the general field that we are inserted as well, because maybe I was thinking about this throughout the listening. Maybe it's not that easy to understand, like, what is the field of the paper, no? But they got it pretty well. That's urban planning. I mean, and that's also pretty cool.
Never ended up mentioning the NDVI.
Never
wasn't
mentioned.
As important to them.
Yeah, exactly. Also interesting to see, no? Yeah.
So we know it's not an exhaustive coverage.
Yeah.
But it's more summarizing, identifying the keywords that can then be related to a lot more information.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. What do you think of the accuracy?
I think it was pretty good.
Yeah.
No, whatever they talked about, and I was a bit skeptical in the moments that they actually dove a bit deeper in the methods. For example, then when they compared the moment of like comparing the pixel of the BGI of the blue-green infrastructure with the unchanged pixel around, they explained pretty well as well. So I would say, and the physical processes as well of the evaporative cooling, the maybe some use of words here and there, but I mean, when you're talking with the general public, that's not the main thing. Like, very specificities of the words are not so relevant, let's say, as long as there's no like awful mistake, which didn't happen.
Large language models can on occasion hallucinate.
Exactly.
But it's not something that we noticed necessarily.
I didn't see any as well.
In this particular example,
And can stutter now as well.
That blew me away. I mean, I haven't listened to any of these because I'm also saving my reaction for the main episode. But to actually hear stuttering, I've heard breaths.
Yeah.
And I know that wasn't you on the other side of the table. And I've heard interruptions of each other.
Yeah. Just like real life, just like how it is. Yeah.
No, it's insane.
Pretty good. Pretty interesting.
If you didn't know this was AI generated, what would you have thought?
That sometimes they sound like a robot here and there, and that's it. Then I would think probably it's just an audio issue, like that the microphone was not working or something, or the audio file. The believability was amazing. And also, I mean, ChatGPT and all these large language models, they are already pretty incredible. So it's being more and more difficult, I think, to separate what is actual humanly created, or even like with images, like what is a real image, what isn't. Sometimes I get the feeling that the thing is not real, but I cannot explain, put into words what is wrong with the thing. And sometimes that was the same feeling with this audio file as well. Like, so there are parts that feels little bit awkward, but would be difficult to give names to what are the... But yeah, the narrative, the text, especially the text. I mean, the audio quality, whatever, I think that's not the main point. But the storyline, the text, I think it was pretty impressive in like how they summarized the paper into this and how they made it more accessible. I mean, that's something that I would send to a friend, for example, to know about my research.
Yeah.
Much more interesting than actually explaining the details of like how to compare one pixel to the other, but mostly like having this holistic view about vegetation planning in the cities. That would be pretty cool too. So that close friend of mine that's not a scientist would kind of understand what I do in life, kind of, you know? So pretty interesting.
Yeah. So in wrapping up this episode, what are your thoughts on AI, generative AI going forward? What are some of the worries or concerns you have? What would you like to see, potential of it?
I think we have to understand how to use it in the best way possible, right? I think there's no escape. It's an amazing tool. Probably won't substitute human work in many times, but will substitute humans that probably don't know how to use AI and don't use it very often, I would say. And with research, I think it's about the same thing. So us in the department in general, like we've been discussing a lot, we've been using a lot AI, trying to find ways to find the best parts of it and also the limitations as any other tool. So every artifact, every technology will have the goods and the bads. It's just a matter of being aware of the limitations as we do with everything. Of course, it cannot do all the work for you, but you have to have a critical view on what they produce. But it's amazing. It's really, I think it's incredible to learn about a new subject. I'm excited to put some papers that on philosophy, maybe even like bringing like more of a general view that, you know, the topic of the philosophy that I want to read is of course important. But I think for us, for example, or other subjects that we're not in the field, I think for us it's nice to have this broader picture, like where does the author came from? What are the previous people that got support and like where does that go through? And, you know, so yeah, pretty cool.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. And thanks, Lucas, for joining me in this little experiment. Yeah. I hope you enjoyed it and that it gave you a bit of shock or surprise.
For sure.
Ideas, ambitions.
Yeah. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter.
And thank you, listeners, for tuning in to this special mini-series on the future of AI and research. If you like this format, do let me know. Follow the show for more episodes of this kind, as also the regular episodes that we have on the Grand Challenges podcast. Thank you very much.
If you like this episode or the show in general, follow it on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts from to be notified of the latest release as soon as it becomes available. Check out the show notes and many other episodes over at petermbach.com/podcast or join the LinkedIn group and share your thoughts.
The podcast's intro and outro song for this mini-series is called Funky Fortune by Danny Shields.
Stay tuned for our next episode in this mini-series to find out more about how AI may or may not tackle the grand challenges